In addition to those prioritized health concerns and that the action teams are working on, in our 2019 Community Health Improvement Plan, we centered addressing racism as a public health issue. And we had been focused on highlighting in the data in our community health assessment and addressing through the action teams racial health inequities and talking about structural racism and structural barriers to health before 2019. But we were very intentional about framing that as our priority focus and thinking about the fact that it doesn't matter which health outcome we're looking at in almost across the health outcomes, whether we're talking about cardiovascular disease or maternal and child health or asthma, we see inequities, differences that are preventable and unjust in health outcomes. And we can tie those differences back to the same inequities, differences that are preventable and unjust in what we call the social determinants of health, which are those things you see in the middle, things like food access and education and employment. And again, in each of those, regardless of which one we're talking about, all of those things are rooted in structural racism. And so this is how we are moving through the work to improve community health, is to unravel these connections and recognize that it isn't a matter of doing health education or putting up flyers and things like that to improve community health. We've really got to get to the root of the matter and talk about and address structural racism and the way it shows up in all of the different social determinants of health. And so we're awfully glad that you've joined us this evening, where we are focused on one of those social determinants, education, and hope that you'll join us for the rest of the series that we'll talk about some of the other social determinants. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. I'll go to the next slide in case you missed this information. If you're interested, please write them this email, hic@llhd.org, and then we have the HIC website at the bottom. So now we will introduce our educational equity panel speakers. As many of us know or will learn tonight, there are many issues that plague the school system. Some of these include a lack of mental health resources, over-policing, an inadequate curriculum, and underrepresentation in teaching staff, as well as a lack of funding. And all of these have been connected to systemic racism. We're excited to introduce the panelists tonight to speak to us about these issues and their experiences. So each one of you will introduce yourself for a few minutes, and we can start with Step Up New London, Megan and Trina.
My apologies. I have like a family thing. Trina, could you introduce yourself real quick? I'll be right back.
Yes.
Thanks.
Hi, everyone. My name is Trina Charles. I am a community organizer at Step Up New London, mother of 3, grandmother of 1. I formerly worked for New London Public Schools in the special education department. We are really excited to be here tonight, and we're excited to hear what everyone else has to do.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. Mommyhood calls. Yeah, thank you for introducing us, Trina. I did kind of walk away, so my apologies if I'm repeating what you've said. So my name is Megan Parrott. I'm the founding director and community organizer for Step Up New London. I'm a mom, and just the work of Step Up New London is really grounded in supporting the voices of Black and Brown parents. And so I'm sure later on we'll talk a little bit more about what we do, but we are excited to be here. And thank you, Trina.
Thank you, Megan and Trina. We'll move on to Zariah from Hearing Voices.
Thank you, Makita. Hello, my name is Zariah Ramos, and like Makita said, I am part of Hearing Voices. I've been a part of Hearing Voices for 3 years now, actually. So yeah, I started my junior year of high school. I'm now a sophomore in college at UConn. Graduated high school at the year of 2019, so just freshly out almost. So yeah, but a little bit about Hearing You Voices. We are a youth-centered organization, and we fight for systematic change that benefits young, Black, Brown, Indigenous, poor, marginalized communities in general. So yeah, we've had like a lot of wins recently. I'll talk more about it later and about the campaigns we're recently like doing at the moment. So hope you guys all enjoy.
And next we have Dr. Manali Sheth from Connecticut College, Professor Manali Sheth.
Hello. So I am Manali Sheth. I am currently education faculty at Connecticut College. I teach courses such as Teaching and Learning for Social Change, Critical Race Theory in Education, and Critical Perspectives in Science Education. I used to be a high school teacher a long time ago, and my research and teaching and community engagement focus on examining and illuminating racism in the education system and trying to figure out the possibilities for liberatory and transformative educational spaces.
Thank you, Professor Manali. So we are going to move into the panel now, but while the panel is going on, I want you to think about these questions and apply them to your life. Just active listening, as we mentioned earlier.
As we're moving into the panel, we came up with some great questions that we think will generate conversation and that will lead to you all learning so much. But we have about 10 minutes at the end for questions and answers. Instead of unmuting yourselves at that time, we're going to ask you to put your questions in the chat, and we'll be looking through the chat throughout and pick a few questions, maybe call them together, and be ready to ask them at the end of our formal questions. So while you're listening, please feel free to add your questions into the chat. And with that, we can get started with the panel.
Great. All right. All of our pictures spotlighted for everyone. Are you in speaker view? Okay, everything looks great. Cool. So earlier we spoke a little bit about the work all of you do, our lovely panelists. And so to start off, can you tell us a little bit about your experience acknowledging racism in education? We can begin with Soraya.
Okay, well, obviously I can talk about this all day. I feel like when it comes to racism in the education system, a lot of people just often think that it's like all up in your face, when really, like, when you think about systematic change, it's not always as crystal clear as it seems, especially within schools. And when I speak about New London, it's crazy because some people might think just because we're a diverse, public schools, that racism doesn't necessarily happen, but it does. So when I think about how it affects like schools, I think about how resources were going from one school rather than the other, which I'll talk about a little later. And just like how oftentimes when I went into school, nothing that I learned about had anything to do about my background. Just being Latinx, I never learned anything about my people. And a lot of people can say that. So just stuff like that, or even like representation within the school, is how all those students don't represent the teachers. And that's so crystal clear to say. So those are just like a few things I'll touch on, and I'll leave the floor for anyone else to speak on it.
Thank you, Z. We can move to Professor Manali.
Yeah, so for me, I went into education or to be a teacher because I had experienced dehumanizing education, I guess, in terms of a lot of what Soraya said, I had not seen myself in the curriculum. I'd not learned about myself. I identify as Asian American. My family had moved back to India, so I did some middle school in India, and then we'd come back. And I realized it's like I was studying schools with completely new eyes. And I realized that it was all fake. Like in my head at that time, there was this idea of, you know, school was about playing the game, school was about a false meritocracy. It wasn't about working hard, it wasn't about learning. And so since then, it was hard for me in the chat to say what I liked about school because I tried to drop out 3 times. And then I figured I would become a teacher in order to try to address some of the problems that I was starting to put names to. When I became a teacher, though, I was still kind of going at it from this framework of if I'm just caring, right? If I just care about my students, if I am just trying to expand access for them into science. I was a science teacher, high school science teacher. And if I just help them navigate the system, that would be enough. And then 2 weeks into my first year of teaching, September 11th happened, and I taught in one of the most racially, ethnically diverse schools in Chicago. And I had to change what I was thinking. Like I had to really figure out what experiences could I use to build bridges with the students I was teaching. I had to really think about what I didn't know and what I needed to understand. And so when my students started asking, you know, why are we learning this? Or why would scientists do that? I stopped thinking about those questions as kids just being kids. And I started engaging with those questions as these students know so much more about their experiences than I do. And really starting to engage with them as profound, justice-oriented and critical questions. And so for me, I started looking at the school system. I had my own eyes around the school system, but started to really look at the school system through the eyes of the various students that I was working with. And then once I went and got my doctoral degree, that's one of the things, my main focus is understanding how racism manifests in curriculum, in pedagogy, in school policy, and how school leadership engages with youth voice initiatives and engages with parents. Do leaders even listen when youth talk? How are we supporting teachers in professional learning that fundamentally changes what they see as the goals of education? And then of course, broader national and state policies. So these are some of the ways and some of the ways I've ended up, I think, doing what I do.
Thank you. That was amazing to hear from like an educational side. Trina?
I apologize. Can you repeat? I'm on Mimi duty tonight. I'm so sorry, but I had to deal with my granddaughter. So can you just repeat what you had said? I'm so sorry.
For sure. The first question was, as a starting point, can you tell us a little bit about your experience acknowledging racism in education?
Well, it started off when my children were young and in school. Single mom, 3 kids, 2 daughters and a son. And you notice different things when you're going to the school to deal with things when it has to do with your children. And you notice the way they deal with certain situations with you, and then how they deal with certain situations with other parents, where it may be a white mom and dad versus a single Black mother. So that's when I first started realizing.
That's very factual. Megan?
I think, so it's interesting because I don't think, right, you go through life and you're like, you just kind of deal with it. I think one of the most important things is Zariah, like, if I had known what I know now, even then I would be much further ahead. And so I remember growing up and being like, this don't seem right. This doesn't feel fair. I went to Nathan Hale actually, and I went to Benny Dover before we went over to Clark Lane, and each experience was just different, and you could tell they treated people different. They treated students different. And even in instances of like bullying, and how even as a victim of bullying in Nathan Hale, me being disciplined and me not actually even laying hands, it's the other person that laid hands. And so I just remember growing up, and even in high school, and I went to Grosso Tech, and again, I'd like bounced around so much that like, you're just like, what is going on? Why are things so different? And being told when I had C's by our AP physics teacher that like I should shift out of the class. And I didn't know that was called marginalization. I didn't know what was happening. And so I dropped out, right? I switched classes. And so all throughout my life, I've made choices, but it felt appropriate, but I didn't realize what was going on. And it wasn't actually until an Undoing Racism workshop that I went through the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, that I was actually given the framework and the analysis to really look at what was happening and like critique it in a way that I had never been able to before. And so that actually enabled me to like go back and think about like, oh, so that's why this happened, or those were factors that were likely showing up. And so for me, right, you just kind of take it when it's you, but then when you have kids, like that's not going to fly anymore, right? Like you have to stand up and you have to really learn to advocate and push back for your kids. And so for me, when recognizing and walking into the schools or and pushing back on things that I now know are grounded in racism, right, and white supremacy, that's what I'm seeing, right? And so the way that my children are being responded to, the way that other children are being responded to, at some point, it sucks because it just lines up with so much. I've said it before, where like I didn't want to be a statistic. I didn't want my children to be a statistic, but statistically speaking, they're following the same patterns that are happening. And so I think for me, it's always been this learning experience. It's always been trying to understand the dynamics that are happening. And you're right, Trina, as a Black single parent, the responses are so different. They're so different. And through the work that we've done with Step Up, we're hearing that and seeing that firsthand. So it's been a challenge. And you get people, because we're from New London, who like, because we're diverse, it's so interesting the worlds we live. Like we can be in the same town and some people are like, what do you mean? Like as if it's like really, really great. Yes, we're diverse. We have an amazing community. And at the same time, racism is very present. And so it just sucks to hear folks push back and say like, oh, you're always making it a race thing. And we're like, well, it's a race thing. So it's just been, my experience has been just learning and then trying to organize collectively and push back, because this individual stuff is just it's not happening. Like if you get people one at a time, you're not going to make movements. But if we can organize and push back collectively, you can shift a whole lot. So
very, very true. Okay, our second question is, how do we create, sometimes we think about racism on an individual level, like for example, providing a district with teacher trainings, which is very important, but it seems like you all are focused on system change. Can you talk a little bit about the difference? We can begin with Professor Manali.
Yeah, so I feel like I'm gonna repeat what Trina, Megan, and Zaraya said. As a critical race theorist, I come at an understanding of racism as it's permanent, it's endemic, and it's normal in society, in US society, and in schools. And so it's not out of the norm, right? It's not aberrant. It's not that when something that is racist happens, like we think often of racism as like a racist event or a racist person. It's about like one bad person, or that racism is just happening at interpersonal levels. And for me, it's really important to think about, and I work with contradictions. So I believe that racism is permanent. And then I also believe that that means that we continually struggle against it. Like that becomes part of life and living a purposeful life. But so for me, working against racism means, at a structural level, means that we're not trying to figure out whether something is racist or not. Like we're not spending energy on that. Rather, we're asking how is this policy a manifestation of racism? How is this curriculum a manifestation of racism? We're not trying to prove that racism exists. Like we're not spending energy on that anymore. Because I think that racism is undoubtedly linked to the history of oppression in this country of all groups of color. And so it's part of the water that we're all swimming in. And so some of the ways we see, and this seems to be coming up in New London and a few schools around Connecticut, where there's a dominant narrative that suggests that because schools are integrated, right, because there are racially diverse students in the same space and the same building, that somehow equal opportunity exists. And if we listen to students of color, if we listen to parents of color, we know that that's not true. And so addressing racism as finding the racist people. One of my colleagues just said, like, we can't train racism out of people. It's actually part of the very policies, curriculum, and ways that we look at education that our schools are operating in, and the standards that we are using, standardized tests that we're using. So for me, addressing racism at systemic levels means that we're actually addressing the constellation of policies and practices that are shaping experiences at school. Yeah, and in terms of teaching, because I work with teachers and I was a teacher, I think that addressing pedagogy and curriculum or changing pedagogy and curriculum to address racism means actually supporting professional learning and not talking about like cultural competence of like, here's what we do, here's what we don't do. Like that is not addressing the root of the problem, which is racism, and which is white supremacy, and this fundamental belief that youth of color and communities of color lack rather than bring rich experiences and already bring resilience to everything that they're doing. Like, what if we started there?
Love that. Z? Z, are you ready?
Oh, you said me? Okay, I'm sorry. So yeah, when I think about this question, I keep coming across the phrase like, there's always going to be a couple bad apples, right? When you think about it as an individual problem, people always come up with the saying, even not just with like education, but even with policing as well. There's always going to be a couple bad apples, right? But you're not really getting to the root of the problem of like, well, how did police even get, formed in the first place? Like, who was it meant to protect? Who was it meant to, harm? And like, you got to look at that when it comes to the education system, right? Like, were Black and brown people at the forefront of making schools? Were we the ones creating the curriculum from the jump? No. So if you don't look at it from like a system change, I don't think anything is really gonna happen. Just like, for example, there was when I was in high school, there was this teacher for years. He was just racist, spitting out racist problems, and everyone was just like, all right, well, we can. some people were on the fence about it, of like getting rid of him or not. Some people were just saying, oh, he's a bad apple, but like you can't change his ways. Well, if you continue to have like this mindset that like, I don't know, people can't change, or like I don't know how to like fully say it, but yeah, basically what I'm saying is like, if the school system was so complacent of having this teacher here for years, like what else are like they're allowing to have when it comes to like the whole school system as a whole? So, and if we don't address it, if we just keep having these teacher meetings, because these teacher meetings of like racism have been taught for years, but obviously nothing is necessarily changing from it. So if you don't go back and see, well, why is it messing up? Are there any practices that we have now that show signs of racism? I don't think anything's going to necessarily change. So yeah, that's just my spiel on it.
Very true. I can attest to that story for sure. Katrina?
For me, it's really simple for me. A system change means a better future in a different direction for my granddaughter or any other grandkids that I have furthermore from here on out. It means a better future and better learning opportunities for not only my kids, but everyone, you know, for all people coming behind all of us. It just means something different, a little better, just for all kids in general, but specifically for Black and brown kids.
Very, really nice. And Megan?
Yeah, I think similar to what Trina said, actually, was like, well, what it means to me is like that regardless of the school that my son goes to, that he's not going to have a starkly different experience, right? So like for me, system change is like it's in layers, right? So we have like individually where like parents, teachers, students, right, are handled or dealt with. And I say handled or dealt with because that's how we're treated, right? Even though they say it's a partnership or a collaboration, no, it just feels as if like, yeah, it just feels like they're dealing with us. And we should be happy with whatever we're given. And in fact, I've been told that in some instances. And so then you get to like the school level, like the whole school, right? Like you can deal with a particular teacher or a particular classroom, but if that shift hasn't happened for the whole school, then your outcomes aren't right. I feel you, Zariah. I feel you. I guess what I'm trying to say even, or get to even, is that like for me, system change isn't even just our school. It's not just Connecticut. It's like nationally what's happening, and how can we synchronize so that we're moving in coordination. And I saw that very similar in the sense of the curriculum, right, for ethnic studies, where because this organizing had been happening so long, that, and has been happening for years and years, and and folks in movements before us have led us to this position, right, to that we were able to, Hearing Youth Voices and Students for Educational Justice and other organizations were able to come together and really coordinate an action, right, and create policy change. And that's just one aspect, I feel like, of system change, right? Like it's hard to really, I think this is the challenge I have. It's really hard because of the capacity, right? Because of our areas to see how these smaller level, local level actions can ripple out and create these like state and national changes, right? But we saw where the local organizing taking place actually created state change, and therefore, right, what other states could be doing could be also in alignment. And I recently, what? Yeah, you're good. I recently had attended a national gathering, and Black organizers from all over the nation were coming together and really talking about how do we create that change? How do we create systemic change? And it was a beautiful and very motivating conversation, but it also felt really daunting, where I'm like, how are y'all talking about global reach? I'm just trying to change stuff in New London. Like, what are you doing? So I think y'all, like, it's holding all these things at once. It's getting rid of the racist teacher. It's getting new curriculum. It's changing policy, and it's shifting culture. I think that's the hugest thing about undoing racism. So I hear you when you said that it's like, it's natural, and like, you can't train racism out of people when it's ingrained in everything that we do. But I think one of the things that my hope is, and what I have been seeing of the folks near me, is that we're really being thoughtful and critiquing what is it that's happening, and like, how are we ourselves perpetuating this, right? And then how are we ourselves raising our youth so that at some point, my hope, right? Like, we wouldn't be doing this if we didn't think it was possible. And for real, we got no choice. Like, we need something different. And so, so my hope is that at some point we're eliminating these. And as we're dismantling some systems and we're recreating, or not recreating, we're creating other systems, that there's this shift that's going to happen. I don't know if I made sense, but yeah, that's where I'm at.
Oh, definitely. And I know, Z, maybe you can speak on that state change that, local efforts really do, ripple out. HYB helped pass the legislation.
Yeah, so my senior year of high school, we testified for Bill HB 7082, and at that time it was 7082 and 83, I'm pretty sure. But yeah, that bill just basically talks about like bringing Black and Latinx history, just studies in general, into the school systems of Connecticut, and thankfully it got passed. So like the curriculum is going to be put, I'm pretty sure, like this year or next year. But yeah, so like we've been working on that, and just, yeah, it was just a huge one for us. And honestly, it was amazing to be a part of. So.
Nice. Okay, our next question is, can you talk a little bit about how you see resources impacting public education and how they are unevenly divided? Perhaps we can start with Trina. So I know that was a long question. So basically, how resources in the public school system is unevenly divided.
I see from working in the school system that it's just basically there's not enough resources. And when there are resources, it's not anything that's directly impacting students of color. A lot of stuff isn't making sense to them. A lot of stuff doesn't resonate with them. So it makes things a little harder, but that's what I've noticed about resources in the schools.
For sure, it's important to personalize like the resources for each student. There's so many needs that continue to go unmet. Next, Z.
Okay, so I could go on about this subject just because New London is really special when it comes to its high schools, especially because when I was there, it was like science and tech magnet high school, the magnet school, and then it was just like the regular high school. So the way science and tech was funded was by bringing other students in from like different cities, and like their towns fund like them to go to the school, and like the funding goes into like different places and stuff like that. But like even just beyond that, like you see how much of a difference from like the magnet school and like New London High School was just treated completely different, even when it comes to the culture of the school. Like I remember being in science and tech, we just got way more opportunities. When it came to SATs, we had a lot more prep than New London High School, and that just shows like the inequities. And also like science and tech was, it had a lot of more like white students rather than like New London High School, which was just predominantly Black and brown. So seeing that was hard because like I grew up, with all my friends from, that went to New London High School, and going to science and tech, I see the inequities, but at the time I feel like I couldn't do anything about it. So it definitely hurt. Another thing is just like with the teachers, I remember being in class, you know, science and tech kids, and teachers would even say, oh, these are the good kids, you know, science and tech are the good kids. They're well behaved, well, you know, just very negative connotations when it comes to students at New London High School. And it was even so like teachers from science and tech would even block students from coming into the school. Mind you, they're both combined schools. Like this was supposed to be one school, but they treated it as like a division. So definitely that, yeah, it was just hard because like you see like different colleges coming to science and tech senior year, right? But New London High School students couldn't come to these presentations that colleges were showing. And it just shows like the inequities firsthand. And like people knew about it and people were outraged, but like nothing, you know, was really being done because now a lot of people know about it. Yeah, so definitely was hard, but like, yeah, that was a major thing. Just when it comes to like class sizes, for example, New London High School would have like 28 students in classes. We'll be all jammed up with one teacher, and then science and tech will have like 8 students in the class. So if you see the difference and see like, if you just go within the schools, like there's a huge difference. And within the culture, I'm pretty sure it changed now because it's kind of integrated, but also there's just a lot. Like I remember also, well, when it comes to policing within the education system with science and tech and New London, there was no police officers in science and tech. And mind you, science and tech had majority white and, you know, a little diversity within there. But if you go to New London, there's police guards on every floor. They're locking bathrooms. No bathrooms were locked in science and tech. So what does that show the students? You know, that just has like a negative connotation. Well, I must be bad just because I go to the school, or I'm not good enough to go to science. I remember friends telling me I'm not good enough to be in science and tech. I'm not good enough to take courses in science and tech. And it's like, no, these teachers and like the way like admin are like forcing like this bad like narrative is just, you know, it's impacting them. And I don't know how it is now, but I hope it's changed because yeah, it's definitely affected a lot of people.
Sure, I can attest to that as well. I was a science and tech student, and I think that really got me really started just seeing the inequities going on.
Can I add one more thing? I'm sorry. Another thing is, I'm so sorry, I'm like ranting on because like I said, I could talk about this all day. But the last thing, what science and tech really loved to do was tokenize a lot of Black and brown students within science and tech as well. I can say I was definitely one of them. They loved to tokenize me and like put me into things. And like, I seen it, but at the time I didn't know what tokenizing was. So like, I would go along with it just cause like for better opportunities. But you know, it's really hard just to know that they seen you as like a statistic, like, oh, you know, she's Latinx, she shows that diverse, like, you know, is still diverse and, you know, we still got good kids, but like, I feel like it was just very wrong in general. But yeah, science and tech did that a lot.
For sure. Megan, can you speak to that?
Word, because I was like, let me jump in. Like, I hear you, yo. But they know what they're doing. So it's gross, y'all. It's so gross. I think for me, the way I've seen it is that I actually have 2 nephews right now, well, we'll see, who go to, well, one's over at Clark Lane and then the other is over at Waterford High School. And I remember, and this was actually years ago, but I remember walking in, and this was before like, well, my eldest nephew was at Quaker Hill. And I remember walking in, and this is around the time that they had the whiteboards now that they have, right? Like the interactive tech, I don't even know what they're called right now, but interactive tech whiteboards. And I remember walking in with my sister to pick up my nephew, and I saw one of them and I was like, oh, wow, you got that? And the teacher was like, oh, that's a few years old. We're supposed to be getting more. And I was like, what? We don't even got that. And you talking about, oh, that's old? What are you talking about, right? I remember like just being agitated actually at that response, as if like they were taking for granted the level of resources that they had compared to what other schools were having. And I'm constantly being reminded, especially when it comes to the resources, the support, they don't necessarily, well, I can't say like across the board, but the level of support, the even on for special education or 504 accommodations is different, and it can be felt. And even when distance learning happened, my nephew, who's at Clark Lane now, came home. I mean, I get it, but I don't. You remember when they just printed out mad paper and like everybody had to pick up papers that weren't even stapled together? You drop that and the wind take it, it's gone. Like, y'all, like, you don't even understand. And yes, thank you for those papers. My nephew brought home books, activity books. My nephew brought home books, right? And we get loose leaf papers, right? And that was a challenge for our school system. So it's not even, it's the way that it's set up, even through funding. And I had just learned that the way our schools are funded, and that's a lot, so I don't even want to mentally go there right now, but it's not that our teachers, it's not that our schools are saying like, we don't want to give these resources. I mean, there are some people making these decisions, but it's really that like, we don't have access to the money and those resources, right? So like, they're trying to make do, but that's still not acceptable, right? Like, we shouldn't have to be the ones who are directly impacted because we haven't figured that out. But I'm pretty sure there's just such a wealth. I know we live in a capitalistic world, and I know we're supposed to be like F capitalism, but like, y'all, we still got to survive in it, right? And so there's so much resources, as if what is it? Like, people are really fearful that we're going to deplete. I mean, you know, I get it. Climate change is real, so that's not the side that I'm talking about, but there's a wealth of resources out there that really could be supporting students, and we're not getting it. And the fact that you can go literally like 5 minutes down the road and walk into another school, and they have their books, they have the resources, they get their field trips, they get their 504 and IEPs met. I mean, that's a struggle anywhere you go, but like, it's just not to the degree that parents and students and teachers and everyone is experiencing in New London. So I guess it's mind-boggling. And then yeah, we could go there because like, it's also budget season. So my brain is all tied into why we got to go over to city council and like really be like, get your stuff together. Ooh, I almost did it. I told myself I wasn't going to cuss today. But I'm just saying, like, my brain is right there with the budget, but it's necessary, right? And the fact that even at city council, education gets played in a way that it's like, if we get this increase, right, like, more taxes have to be paid. But then on the side is where, like, what was it, a couple years ago, where it's almost as if we were supposed to get an increase, but then they put it on the schools to have to take care of the maintenance and all of that, and gave us an expenditure, which pretty much canceled it out. So city was like, here's more money, but wait, you got to pay this, and that's going to cost a lot of money. And so it's that stuff that like really is starting to get to me, that I'm like, I wish our community had more integrity, our community leaders, my apologies, had more integrity when it comes to adequately funding our schools. I'm tired of my kid. I'm tired even now for the several months. I mean, now he's back in, but even in distance learning, for me to say my child who has ADHD is really having a hard time learning on the computer, for there still not to be some type of booklet, some type of something coming home that we can physically touch. And for parents who are really struggling because we don't know the answers, who don't have a resource to look on to help our children at home. And I'm really tired of it. I'm sorry I just went on this whole thing. I'm gonna stop talking now, but I could talk on too.
No, you really snapped. And also when you said like school's just 5 minutes away, I remember leaving high school passing Waterford schools, like literally 5 minutes away. I'm just like, wow, like the difference is astronomical. But we can move on to Professor Manali.
Keep talking. So it's, for me, the resources follow white parents and white kids. We've known that. That's why. So I don't study school funding, but we know now pretty much that Brown v. Board, right, that supposedly integrated schools because separate was unequal, actually shifted funding and resources and opportunities more towards white families and white teachers and white parents than communities of color. And so I think what we're seeing now is this, it's getting reproduced. It continues to be reproduced. We are seeing some of the biggest shifts between funding moving from education being a public good to becoming a privatized good with magnet schools, with charter schools, with, this is also happening in higher ed, where some companies and some corporations are profiting the most from student loans than students of color, communities of color, parents of color. And so we know that there are different models for school funding than property taxes. We know that there are resources. This idea that there's a scarcity of resources, and so we have to make decisions between, do we want bilingual education or do we want science education? Do we want electives, right? Do we want ethnic studies curriculum or do we want this? Like these are not choices that well-resourced, well-financially resourced districts have to make. And so if we can, I would press, and I know that there are grassroots movements and local movements where people are pushing for different funding models and where people are bringing to light the way that privatization is impacting public schooling, and that there are resources available. It's just that those resources are being distributed using race-conscious policies. So a lot of times people think that attending to communities of color, I think it was Megan, was it you who, you know, this idea of the race card, the race card is always being played because these policies are white race conscious. They have been designed to support white success. And so it's not that there was not race consciousness done when it was decided which schools would get what kind of funding, or that property taxes would be what decided school funding. That was a race conscious decision, actually. It was just made to distribute resources to white communities over communities of color. And so what we need to be pressing for is race-conscious policies that are supporting communities of color, that are considering the interests and needs and concerns of communities of color in order to undo these historical systems that have been in place. So I would amplify what has already been said and think about strategies around using race consciousness in a way that undoes the white race consciousness that has happened. And then I also want to, so I think about resources more broadly also in schools, as Zaraya said, in terms of instructional time, in terms of class sizes, in terms of teacher salaries, right? For me, it's like professional learning time. And so thinking about resources more broadly and opportunities more broadly in terms of its money, and it's also how that money is being distributed in schools. Because I think, like, even if you have students of color in a school, even if you have an integrated school or school district, that doesn't mean that within the school district or even within the same school, resources are being distributed equitably, you know? So, yeah, I can stop there, but I really want to just amplify what has been said in terms of we do need race conscious resource distribution in order to undo the race consciousness that is already supporting white supremacist policies and practices.
Thank you so much. I really like that you use the phrase white race conscious. I think that's a great term to look into, to understand that, you know, since these curriculums and so much more is created by, you know, white people, it's definitely swayed in that direction. Just before we go on to the next question, we have 10 minutes for 2 more questions. So keep that in mind with your answers. Our next question is, how do we create freeing spaces, and in the words of Professor Manali, where we can love ourselves in our full diversity, experience joy, and find purpose? Tell us about what you envision when you think of these things. And I guess we can start with Professor Manali.
I'll just keep it short because I feel like Trina, Megan, Zaraya are creating those spaces. I think it's in the spaces that we create, the home spaces, the community spaces, the coalitional spaces, where we are valuing our cultures, where we are recognizing our own resilience, where we're recognizing that we do this to survive, right? We're doing this because we need to survive. We're doing this because we need to thrive. And so so Professor Derek Bell, he talks about racial realism in terms of maybe going for equality. If racism is permanent, going for equality is a goal that's throwing us off. Like, what would we do in our lives, with our lives, individually and collectively, if we weren't trying to prove racism and we were trying to fight it, right? We were trying to fight it and knowing that fighting it meant also finding joy in what we could. And so I think those are some of the things that we're doing of figuring out what cultural practices we value and we want to sustain. It means speaking our languages. It means loving who we are. It means that when the media refuse to call things racist hate crimes, we can say that they are, and we can love the people who the media is trying to reconstruct as morally degraded. It means looking at ourselves and our communities and the strengths and assets that we bring, and deeply and radically loving ourselves and our communities, even when we don't agree, coming to people with love, but a justice-oriented love. So
I just want to speak on that really quickly. I saw a video by Angela Davis. It was at Afropunk, which is a annual festival, and she said that self-care and healing and attention to the body and the spiritual dimension, all of this is now a part of radical social justice struggles. And she was just talking about how self-care and things of that sort was something that was lacking from a lot of movements, you know, when she was coming up in the social justice movement, and how all of this self-care and community love that, you know, we're really pushing for even more nowadays is so important to, you know, really staying resilient in this struggle. And also you talked about community, and I can really speak to that. I was at Human Voices a lot this summer, and I can definitely say I felt a lot of community and a lot of love there, amidst everything going on, like just seeing people who look like me, like my age, just, you know, people who are familiar and people who I can really trust. So that was really a great experience. So I guess we can move on to Z.
Yeah, so when it comes to this question, like I'm really conflicted. So like on like one hand, I just think about hearing voices like Makita said about the amount of love and care and like vulnerability you could really have in this space. And I feel like if we took that within other spaces, yes, that's definitely a way I can envision, you know, seeing freedom and joy and all the good things when it comes to like the work. But there's another side where I remember we're currently like doing interviews right now when it comes to high schoolers, and so we asked this question to like envision like what freedom is and, you know, what does it look like to them. And, you know, some students don't know, and like it's okay to not know what freedom and, you know, what it looks like to, you know, not have a space that's not meant for you, because honestly, like I feel this exact same way. I never been in a space where I felt completely free with my identity and like who I am. So yeah, sometimes it's kind of hard to envision it if you never had it before. So I just want to like make space and say like that's perfectly okay if you don't know, but like even if you do, like that's amazing as well. So definitely wanted to highlight that.
For sure. Megan?
Z, I fucking love you.
Love you too.
That's where my brain was at. I was like, because I mean, I think the creativity and the freedom of dreaming has been kind of stifled for Black and Brown students and parents and community. And so I really was like, yeah, what does that look like? How do you experience that? And it just sounds like I would literally only be saying the things that we keep saying. It's like walking in and teachers look like us. And not even and I would say like, and it's around a lot of different dynamics. So I also want to say it's not just race, it is around so many aspects of our identity, including like, and not limited to our gender identification, to our different disabilities or abilities, depending on how folks personally relate to that, just because there is a variation of folks on what that means. And it means like, yeah, smaller class sizes. It means parents being able to send their students to school and not fearing for their child's mental health. Like, how many times have I heard from parents who are literally like, do you want my child to kill themselves before you are listening? Like, it has gotten to that point, and it's heartbreaking and it's awful. So those are the things that wouldn't be happening. But what would it look like? What would replace it? You know, that's so hard when you haven't seen it. So I just appreciate you, Z, for like calling that. It's something that even now we're trying to figure. And in fact, there are areas. So Step Up just completed. We interviewed almost 90 parents around like what parents, staff, community partners, students, alum, 89 people around what was your experience like in this past year in London Public Schools. And that was done last year. And the solutions were beautiful. And there were points where we're now just dreaming what that could be like. And when in our brain, there's all these limitations, it just gets harder to dream, you know? So, and I'm thinking of like, I'm kind of doing like a subtle shout out to you, but when you're like, I just want to create something different, I'm like, yes. And oh, what does that look like? You know, how would that meet the needs of more than one school, right? Like, how can we stretch beyond an individual school and really hit all of our communities? So I think that's something we're still dreaming and we're practicing and having to really work that part of our brain. I know what I want when I think about like the life of like I want to live in a home with a backyard that I don't have to rent. And I have like that vision, but what does equitable education, what does that vision look like? It's something that that just still has to be worked on. So that's a good question.
For sure, right? It's like an imagination almost because we're so far from that. Trina?
So when I saw this question, right, I was like, okay, let's think about it. So I feel like sometimes in communities of color, we can be our own worst enemies, right? Going against each other, saying things, doing things against each other. So I think of lifting each other up and supporting one another, collectively using our voices and knowing it's okay for us to come together and use our voices and our power to correct the things that we feel that is wrong. And it's okay for us to make changes and to want those changes and demand those changes for our children, and that there's nothing wrong with that. And it's okay for us to come together, be that collective, and to make those changes.
Very true. We're gonna wrap up the panel though. We're gonna save the questions for later. I'm gonna toss to Isabel, who has been monitoring the chat, but I just want to thank our panelists so much for sharing your insight and your stories. I learned so much more tonight. I heard a few terms and phrases that I would definitely look up and research myself, and I hope everyone in the audience will do the same thing. Isabel?
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much to all of our panelists. Just a few questions came in the chat. One from Jada Fitzpatrick. As a recent graduate of Connecticut College, I became very familiar with how racism functions on an institutional level at a PWI. I'm sure this is something many people across different institutions relate to. To what degree do higher education institutions hold responsibility for addressing this on all levels? And what are some specific steps these institutions should take to address it that go beyond anti-racism training? I don't know, Dr. Sheff, if you want to take a whack at that one.
I can start us off. I could talk on this. I could talk on this for a long time. Yes, higher ed institutions do have a role in this. I don't even know where to start. Give me a moment to get my thoughts together. So I began in Connecticut College in fall 2019, and it's the first private school I've ever taught at. And I was floored at the amount of resources and the class sizes, and just this feeling that it's enough to talk abstractly about racism and intersectional oppressions, and to not get down to the level of what is our role in this? Like individually, how do we perpetuate these things? How do we fight them? How do we benefit? How do we, as Connecticut College students who are over here, predominantly white, yes, but also students of color, like how are we over here getting the opportunity to learn these ideas, take these courses, do amazing global, local engagement projects? Just, it's like the world is your oyster when we are not contributing as a college more to the community that the college is in, first of all, but then also more broadly. And so I think that has been the struggle of, I think, faculty of color at Connecticut College, and I included in that, of how do we how do we make this education purposeful, and how do we make it in a way that is accountable to the communities we care about? I think we all, the faculty of color that I know at least, we came to this work with a sense of purpose for the communities we care about, for communities of color, and we want to be accountable to them. And there are higher ed structures, I think, that prevent that from happening. So some of the higher education policies that we push for, of course, is race-conscious affirmative action. When you've excluded entire groups of people from going to college for 200 years, it's not problematic to say that there needs to be different admissions policies. There needs to be different student retention policies. There needs to be different curriculum. A lot of times faculty who do community engaged work, who do research that exposes racism and intersectional oppressions, that work is not valued as much. So there's definitely pushes for changing tenure policies. We also become more vulnerable, and that's how the institution actually stops us from doing this work. So showing up on a panel and talking about white supremacy and racism and doing research that illuminates how racism is happening in teacher education programs. There are institutional policies that are used to silence that work. And so we are constantly pushing back to try to figure out, like, how do we do that? And also funding. I mean, around the country, you have HBCUs, you have Latinx serving institutions, you have APITA institutions, higher ed institutions, where the funding is being choked out. And it's going to predominantly white institutions. And so there are movements, and they have to be faculty, student, and community social movements to push back on these policies that are trying to roll back whatever transformations movements in the 70s started. So that's a start. I mean, we can't focus on just the theory. Like, it's not enough. Knowing is not enough. We have to actually do something with that knowledge. And, something that I say in my classes is this is not a teaching and learning for grades class. This is a teaching and learning for social change class. And that starts with you. And so how are you going to get there? What work do you need to do in order to get there? How are you going to teach kids if you can't say the word race and racism? Like that's the number one question I ask in my class. How are you going to work with youth of color? Why would I send my kid to you if you can't say the words race and racism in a way that tells me that you understand what you need to do for the youth that are going to be before you? And that hurts their feelings sometimes. And it's like, I would rather hurt your feelings than you go around perpetuating the things that Soraya is talking about.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sheth. There's so much to talk about with higher ed on this issue, and you've just gotten us started. I want to pass it to Makita for our final question. Go ahead, Makita.
Sure. I had a question in the chat. For HYV and Step Up New London, what have the reactions been from leaders in the system, in the school system of the city, to your campaigns, and how have they could have been different? I guess we can start with C.
Okay, so currently Hearing Voices is working on 2 campaigns right now, that being the People's Budget, which is just reallocating just like the money when it comes to the budget, because we are in budget season. So we're trying to basically defund the police and take that money and put it into services that actually help and benefit Black and Brown people in London. So that is the first one. And then the second one is getting cops out of schools. So yeah, it's a lot. So obviously there's a lot of like mixed reactions we're getting. Some people are like completely like in support of us. Some people are completely against us. And then there's people that like, you know, want to hear us, but not really, you know? So yeah, when it comes to like when it comes to just like city council in general, yeah, it's difficult because you see people that look like you, right? Because like city council is like more like, you know, diverse with this time around, but I still feel like they're not hearing us, you know? I really feel like there's just like a huge blockage. I feel like as almost as if they're hesitant for change. And it's hard because it's like, if you're gonna declare like racism a public issue, a health issue within New London, wouldn't you want like funding to go into funding go into like places to prevent that, rather than like putting the money into places where it's actually like hurting us, like policing, like, you know? So yeah, very mixed, honestly. Like I can't really say there's ever been a time Hearing You Voices has had a campaign and we've had like full support or full just people against us. So yeah, it's very mixed. What can be different or better? More people coming to city council meetings, more people coming to Board of Ed meetings, because I promise you, if you sit down at one of them, you'll be agitated enough to want to help. So it's really getting people in those meetings, getting people agitated enough to care. And like agitation, yeah, I don't know, it might be a little not aggressive, but agitation might scare people or might not want people to do the work. But I don't know, like you gotta have some passion in you to do this work, you know? Like I feel like this work is so hard, and like there's gonna be times you're gonna be so angry. Like last city council meeting, I was furious. I was so mad. But like, you know, there's times where you have to think like this is for the better good of the city. So like, you know what, I'm just still gonna fight. So yeah, when it comes to that, also when it comes to cops out of schools, yeah, so a lot of people are scared to take cops out of schools. They think like we need police in our schools, that it's the only way to keep our students safe. But when you really think about it, why is it that Black and Brown schools are the only schools, especially within New London County, that have police in them? If you go to Waterford, you won't see a police officer in there. If you go to the Ledyard or, you know, other schools, there's no police officer. So why is it that New London has it? Are you just criminalizing the students? And, you know, you're not trying to change this narrative that, you know, Black and Brown students are, you know, quote unquote bad. So yeah, there's a lot. And I feel like a lot of people are so complacent, so used to cops in schools that they feel like there's no other option. But Hearing Voices we have a whole platform showing people like there are options. So if you literally just listen to the youth and like listen to what we have to say, we can show you that there's other ways. So really just having like this ageism complex that we don't know what we're talking about out the window, you know? Like we're in the schools right now, so like we know what we want. So yeah, just making sure people are listening to us and making sure like people care enough to, you know, go to these meetings and have like some passion in their hearts to know like this shit is fucked up, you know? Sorry for my language, but yeah.
No, that's so true. And I just want to speak on like the policing topic. It's like, you know, they say we're not going to be safe without them, but like let's ask what they're really doing like right now. Like if we took them away, like if we took their positions away so that what they're doing right now like was just an open position, like our safety would be fine, in my opinion, for the most part, because a lot of times like they may remove a student for being out of dress code, which has its problems attached to it, sexism and whatnot, you know, or little things like that, or interrogating students in the hallway who don't have a pass to go to the bathroom, or they went to the bathroom too many times that week, you know? Because I remember at one point, like there were like hallway monitors, like teachers were like hallway monitors every period, and we would have to like sign our names in a book when we went to the bathroom. So just things like that, it doesn't really make sense, but I just want to thank Easy for that. It's honestly a little bit of nostalgia to think back on high school, but I just want to thank all of you, all of our panelists tonight for sharing your stories again. We have some next steps for you all, some action steps for you all to take, and we also have a poll that Alicia is going to talk about a little bit.
I'm supposed to talk about the poll, but I'm kind of curious what Step Up New London has to say about their campaign. I know we're short on time, but maybe we can give you all a chance to talk about your campaign for a minute too. And if folks are willing to stay on for a couple extra minutes, I think that would be worth it.
Word. Thank you, Alicia. I think very similar to what Z said is that you have like different people who some support, some don't. And then you have some folks in the middle who do support it, but then like on this in their actions are kind of showing otherwise. I think sometimes that is embedded with like fear of retaliation, fear of like not knowing, and fear of actually trusting Black and brown people. So I just want to call that out too. So we are kind of in the beginning of our campaign. I had referenced earlier where we had interviewed a good amount of parents, and through a pandemic, by the way, that we were able to do some in-depth interviews with folks, and we ended up releasing our report card, which ultimately we had asked parents like, in the series of questions, we also asked like from, very satisfied to very unsatisfied, and like ranked these areas between academic, education to safety to school discipline. And ultimately all these things landed New London Public Schools with the D. And they came pretty strong. People were not happy. And I've said it, I think even Trina, like telling you, like New London Public Schools does not need us to stroke their ego. They do it themselves in their marketing, and like they uplift it. And that's not to say that there are teachers, there are people, admin who like really, they care and are trying their hardest, but that still doesn't stop the impact that's happening. And that's also where you get like these well-intentioned folks who are still perpetuating the same problems. And so there was a lot of feelings around that image. And we then like tried to present to a particular group in New London and in New London Public Schools. And ultimately we were told pretty much in both instances, like we had to have a separate meeting with the school because we used the school colors, we used the font, and it was not on purpose, the colors, because that's New London. We are New London parents. Like, school does not own those colors. That's our colors. That's our community's colors. And so because we used the font, because we used the colors, because we had New London Public Schools logo on there, we had to have a separate meeting. And so I got called in. I actually brought Trina in because I was like, I'm not going in this alone. And so between that meeting and then the presentation, in both of those meetings, we were actually told to lawyer up. If we continue to use that language, if we continue to say these things, then we should lawyer up. And our information was targeted. Oh, did we connect with Connecticut College to make sure our questions were credible? Is what and it's because they came with this background of like statistics and knowledge around like academic, right? It was all academic based, where because our research wasn't done in a way that they deemed, they didn't even really know. Actually, they were pulling that out before we even started the presentation, to be honest. And they, even though they won't say they attacked the credibility, they did. And by that end of that phone call, they also, and it was actually also around the 504 and IEPs, which is a legal thing, that when we told them, well, this is what parents are experiencing, they told us to lawyer up. So needless to say, we've been calling around trying to get support, haven't really been able to find anybody. So like if anybody knows, we now have a more of an idea, having talked to a couple lawyers, what we're looking at, but we want to continue to do this work, but not also get hit with legal ramifications, because we're not lying. We would not be doing this. Z, hearing your voices, like we would not be doing this if it weren't true. And so I'm going to stop because I know we're over, but like, it's interesting because like, I don't, I want to, they're aggressive as hell. like y'all really are like, we want to hear it. And then as soon as we tell them, they want to shut it down, right? Like, oh, and then we were told, oh, well, it was only 89 parents. We would have liked to hear from like 300 and more. And I'm like, first of all, you're not even doing the work. And 89 parents or community folks and alumni, that's actually a lot to be sitting down on like an hour and a half at a time, to be doing all of this. And the school's not even doing that. And the reason why we're doing it is because we're asking the questions that matter to us. The school is not going to say, have you experienced racism in the past year? If so, what happened? What would you like to see different? They're not going to ask that question. Want to know why? Because it's a liability. They don't want to know because it opens them up. It opens them up to say that they're wrong. It opens them up to say that there are things that are going on, and that's frustrating. And so if we're there and people are trusting us, the other kind of counter though, is that like we 20% of those folks were actually New London staff. 20% of them was an overlap between parents who were also working in the school system. And they felt that if they were to vocalize, they felt that if people were to know what they've said, that they would actually receive retaliation. And that's why we're here, because there is a level of protection that you get from community showing up. And I think if anything too, it shows that the complexity about and the support about like the inside outside approach, but that like even the people on the inside who have to make a living, who like are also trying to feed their kids at home, that they're in these like really restrictive environments that they themselves can't even speak up. And so it's been a lot. And we're just going to we're continuing the work that we're doing. And so, yeah, it's been a roller coaster ride, yo. Thank you, Alicia, for.
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much for sharing. Like, to me as a community member here, it's just so interesting to see what people put on the outside and on their marketing, and then to hear the retaliation and to know what's actually happening. It's infuriating. And I think it's so important to have these spaces to talk about it, because you almost wouldn't believe the reactions sometimes. Mm-hmm. So thank you for sharing. I'm like feeling it in my body, how angry I am about those things right now. Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. No, go.
I just want to say, like, it wasn't to the point where we stopped, but that's a trigger. Like, y'all really gonna say get legal? Like, what? Like, and we ourselves had to like really cope with some like aftercare after that. We had to team up after, really feel out like how are folks feeling, because in that meeting where we thought we were welcome, where it was actually a place to discuss racial equity in New London public schools, it was just, those dynamics were crazy. And for myself, I can only speak for myself, it took at least like 3 days to like really work through what was happening, And so, yeah, thank you.
No, thank you for sharing. And thank you all for the work you're doing. Like, this conversation has been amazing. I've learned a lot. I'm feeling a lot. And I'm excited to take some action. And I know Makita's going to put up a slide about some ways that you all can take some action. We know we can support these organizations, and we'll do a follow-up with an email of ways you can support these campaigns. But in the meantime, you can also support by making it possible for us to have more of these by participating in our short little survey right now for us to just kind of know the impact of this and to be able to share how impactful this is. So we're going to keep this up for like 2 minutes. I promise it's short. You can do some multiple choice on a couple of these questions, but basically we're asking you how you would rank the event. Did the presenters, whew, I'm going too fast right now, help you understand the connections between racism and public health? Do you envision events like this informing your work? And are you interested in being more a part of this? So please look through these 5 questions. Like I said, we're just going to take 2 minutes and then we can wrap up with some next steps. Thank you.
Yes, so our next racism or public health, racism as a public health issue panel is on the topic of housing. It will be next month on April 28th. As Z mentioned earlier, the People's Budget Campaign and the Cops Out of School campaign, definitely support those in whatever ways you can. Visit their social media, their Facebook pages to get more information on that. Attend City Council and Board of Education meetings and support community organizations with your resources and time. A lot of them are getting a lot of work done by young people, and they would love your resources and time, whatever that looks like for you, to help with the work that they're doing.
So much for that, Nikita. And I can see almost everybody. We've got 64% of you voted. So I know some of you are still in process. Please feel free to finish up. Like I said, I have all of your information from registering for the Zoom. So I'm happy to send out links to the campaign and of course an invitation to talk about housing next month. So with that, if you all want to finish up your poll, and we'll say good night and we'll see you next month. An extra huge thank you to all of the panelists and Makita for moderating. That was incredible. I really appreciate it. I'm leaving the night inspired.